Welcome everyone to the CIAT Scotland East event. We are meeting here with Frank Doherty today to talk about the new compliance plan approach. I'll let Frank introduce himself and tell us a little bit more about all the legislative changes in Scotland. Frank, over to you.
Thanks very much. So my name's Frank Doherty. I work in the Building Standards Division in the Scottish Government. I've been here permanently since last August, but I was on a secondment before that, and I've spent the last 30 years in building standards on the local authority side. So I like to think I understand about building standards, and hopefully we can go through our compliance plan approach, why we're doing it, and what we're doing and where we are with it today. So I'm just going to now hide behind some slides, if I can get this to work like it did before. So hopefully you can see my first slide there. And it's basically just gives us an idea of the kind of things we're talking to various groups about over the next few months. About the compliance plan, the different elements there. I'm going to talk to 4 of those today, not go into the certification of design construction and the kind of risk-based approach that we are looking to develop, but talk about the compliance plan approach itself and where we are with it. So you can see the 2 pictures there, one Grenfell, one the Edinburgh schools collapse that happened. So those are, I suppose, 2 of the things that kind of kicked off the reason for developing this compliance plan and approach. So we know the industry needs to change. We know that Dame Judith Hackett considers industries in the race to the bottom and needs this culture change, and industry needs to take responsibility for its work. And I was speaking to a so-called expert in doing presentations, and he said, portray your topic as a battle of good against evil. So if we're talking about minimum standards, we're talking about life safety, I would say that if all the building standard system is trying to do is ensure that we have minimum standards for safety in new buildings, as well as the energy and sustainability elements. Basically, what we want to do is get industry to take this seriously. And in that battle against good or evil, as it was termed, and I don't think I'll use this moving forward, but you're the good guys, you're the professionals that can make that difference moving forward. So the compliance plan approach, the role of the compliance plan manager, the role of the compliance plan seeks basically to strengthen the building standards system. Making sure everybody, including the local authority building standards team, do what the system has asked them to do as a minimum. We might, and we have had conversations with individuals about thinking about limiting their liability, about difficulty in PI insurance if they're held strictly liable for things, but I'd maybe ask everybody to think about not about limiting your liability so much, but about your role and responsibility for creating those the safe buildings for people to work in and play in. So the first, I'll go through a bit of background of the compliance plan approach, how we got to where we are. The Building Standards Features Board, where that came from. Basically, we had failings in the construction of some Edinburgh schools, leading to collapse. We had fire at Grenfell Tower, followed on a couple of years after that, and various other high-profile failures in Scotland that led to the formation of a ministerial working group on building and fire safety back in 2007, just after the Grenfell fire. And that working group, ministerial working group, created a number of things, included requirements for smoke alarms in all new buildings, review panels on compliance and enforcement and on fire safety, and other changes around cladding on buildings over 11 metres, about non-combustibility and that kind of thing. One of the other things it did was create the Building Standards Features Board. And that board remit is to advise a broad programme of work, looking at basically strengthening the building standards system in Scotland. While Dame Judith Hackett considered that the UK building control system, building regulatory system, was broken, the view in Scotland of ministers after going through these review panels was that the system in Scotland isn't broken, but it definitely needs some strengthening. So the Futures Board we start with a number of work streams, and those work streams in the Futures Board itself have been taken forward in conjunction with industry. In fact, there are more industry members on the Building Standards Futures Board than there are civil servants or local authority members, and those are some of the stakeholders involved in the Building Standards Futures Board itself, but also in some of the work streams working groups. There were 7 work streams initially in 2019, and those have been worked on vigorously over the last number of years. And from last year, because of COVID, it was felt that the Futures Board need to be extended by another couple of years to complete its work. But the work streams have been whittled down into 4, partly because 2 of those have completed their work, and 1, the verification standards, the standards that apply to the local authority building standards verifier, is kind of being brought into the delivery model. But the one we're interested in today is the compliance plan approach, and maybe to say a couple of words that, as I said, the Building Standards Future Board isn't operating in isolation, just civil servants. Membership is drawn from across construction bodies in Scotland, including the Construction Leadership Forum. The head of Building Standards of Scottish Government is also a member of the Construction Leadership Forum, and at its heart, the CLF is a partnership between industry and the public sector. So that's kind of reflected in the Construction Accord, where the Accord recognises that high quality and regulatory compliant services and end products and buildings are pretty essential if we're going to transform the sector in a positive way. The Construction Quality Improvement Collaborative, or the CQIC, as I'm going to refer to it from now on, in particular is work that we've engaged quite closely with, because again in that work it's recognised that building standards compliance is a core element of good quality construction. Not just compliance of the end product, but how you get there, complying with the procedures, the preemptive approvals we have in Scotland, the local authority inspections and checks that are carried out. And in fact, our early adopter scheme for the compliance plan, which I'll mention a wee bit later on, that scheme is hosted on the CQIC website. So while that scheme's currently closed, phase 1 is currently closed to the early adopters, the early adopters version of our Compliance Handbook will give you an idea of where we are with developing a handbook and training materials for the compliance plan approach. And there's model forms there for anybody to look at. These are all works in progress, as I'll mention again later on. But just to note that we haven't developed a compliance plan approach in isolation from industry, but with industry, and the intention is for it to be further developed in that same fashion. So I'll jump to slide there. So what is the compliance plan? So the 2 kind of main straplines of the compliance plan are that what we want to do with the approach is support compliance with approved building warrant plans and the regulations for all projects, whether they're big, small, simple or complex. And the other main thing we want to do is support those existing roles of the relevant person and the verifier. Those are the 2 roles within legislation that are key when it comes to duty holders. The compliance plan itself, we had a discussion in the team this morning, which highlighted that these 4 titles at the top there are a bit confusing. We're finding them a wee bit confusing if you step away from it after the holidays, come back and think, what are these things we're talking about again? But essentially, it's a pre-warrant application. That application is asking for a bit of an assessment from the local authority and is proposing what the compliance plan should be. That compliance plan submission that comes out of that agreed in principle is what's submitted with your building warrant application, what will be. And that is then approved as an approved compliance plan with your building warrant when that gets approved. That document then becomes a live document for the build, and at completion stage, the completed compliance plan is one of the documents that's used in considering the completion certificate. Now, this is all in development still, but this is what we're proposing at the moment. So if we think about the existing building standards process at the moment, you make your application for warrant, you get it approved, you do that build in the middle, you submit your completion certificate, and that gets accepted if everything's okay. So that's kind of where we are at the moment. In 2012, we introduced this concept of a construction compliance notification plan. So from 2012, every building warrant issued in Scotland should have one of these issued with them. And that basically tells the developer, the relevant person, contractor, architect, whoever's involved with the project, at what stages the local authority wants to come out and do an inspection or is seeking some information, whether that's certification or whatever. And normally that has an appendix to it that tells you what is all the information that that local authority building standards verifier will look for at the completion stage. So that's kind of the process we have just now. For high risk buildings, this new compliance plan process would look a wee bit more like this, where you make that pre-warrant application. So with Kinkin at the moment, that would be a minimum of 3 months before a warrant application is going to be proposed to be made. You get that compliance plan agreed in principle, and that forms part of your building warrant submission. That, as I said earlier, that proof compliance plan is issued with the building warrant, and then it becomes a live document that needs to be accessible in a safe place, but accessible to the compliance plan manager and accessible to the local authority building standards team, so that they can update it as work progresses. And as I say, that completed compliance plan should be completed or in a state that shows that compliance has been achieved at the completion stage. So it's a document that informs that consideration of a completion certificate. That's for what we're calling high-risk buildings at the moment, and I'll come on to that in a wee bit. For those that we're not considering as high-risk buildings, the proposal would be very similar, just we don't have the compliance plan manager and we don't have that pre-application submission. So for those jobs that are not high risk, that are complex, that are not complex, that we would be looking at a live compliance plan regardless, whether that's a full compliance plan or whether that's similar to the CCNP for smaller works. We're working our way through that to see what that would look like. Fundamentally, though, the compliance plan is intended to do a number of things. Identify at an early stage what that approach to compliance is and how that might be evident. So picking up things like we're going to have a fire engineer in this job because we're not going to comply with the guidance for travel distance or whatever. So it wants to consider those things up front before a warrant application is made, making sure that the applicant's considered all the things that they need to do, so that when their application comes in, it should be a smoother process. And once approved, that compliance plan documents a number of things. Things that I've shown there, details of the design delivery team, timescales, and inspection and check stages. Now we detail those, but as a live document, it would also detail when those things change and when those things are maybe completed, if it's an inspection, for example. As I say, it's intended that's a live document, and it's worked on and updated as the project continues on. So that's the basics of the compliance plan. In terms of the compliance plan manager, that role, what is that? Well, the best way for us to, I suppose, to explain that, and I'll go past this strap line again, is that it's a role that is specifically there to cater for high-risk buildings. At the moment, this is a definition of high-risk buildings. It's not the high-rise or high-risk buildings they have proposed in England, but it's wider than that. And this has been through a public consultation, which was largely agreed with. One that was a bit less, I think it was a 30% of people thought a compliance plan manager should be in place for low-rise volume house building. Everything else was really well received. Low-rise volume house building, we think that's fair enough. Maybe we don't need a compliance plan manager, and actually maybe we need a separate approach. So we are working on a separate approach for low-rise volume house building. But as you can see, we're not just talking about buildings that are tall. We're talking about buildings where there's a risk to users or people that are in those buildings, whether it's vulnerable people in hospitals or residential care buildings, or whether it's people that are expecting to attend a building like a community centre or whatever, and understand that they're going to be safe in there. We are proposing, I'm not going to talk about in this session, a pathways approach. So we may in time not talk about high risk buildings at all, but just talk about all buildings, but have a risk process that pulls out the ones that are higher risk, rather than arbitrary because it's all over 11 metres, and apply a more robust process depending on how high the risk of what would happen if there was a failure to comply. But we thought, I thought certainly in order to explain where the compliance plan manager fits in, we should probably try and go through what the current building standard system is and who the roles and responsibilities are. Excuse me. So at the moment, we have a number of people within the building standard system that have roles and responsibilities. A couple of them in there are what you consider duty holders. But if we go through them and their current responsibilities and roles, and then stick in the compliance plan manager where we think he fits, that might help to explain what our thinking is. So the first person is the applicant. The applicant currently can be anybody that submits a building warrant application. They don't have to own a building. They don't have to have any relationship to a building, but they can submit an application for it. They can also have other roles, so the applicant can also be the relevant person, could be the owner, could be the architect, agent, engineer, could be anybody really. And they can sign the building warrant application form, and they do make a declaration on that application form as to an accuracy of information. And it is an offence under the Act for anybody to make a false statement on a building warrant application. Now, currently, that's, I can't remember what the level it is, but it's a fine of about £5,000 maximum. Part of the enforcement and sanctions work that we're looking at is looking to raise that punishment to be a £50,000 fine or up to 2 years imprisonment potentially for serious offences. So as part of the strengthening, we're not just looking at strengthening the roles, but we're looking at strengthening the consequences of an offence under the Act. The agent of the applicant, and I make no apologies for giving them a bow tie because it amused me, but that could be an architect, it could be an architectural technician, it could be anybody really can act as an agent. There's no requisite for being any particular professional. And they can submit an application on behalf of an applicant, as I said. They can also sign the completion certificate on behalf of the applicant. And they can sign the building warrant on behalf of the applicant. And again, knowingly or recklessly making an application for warrant, and I'll come on to the completion one soon, is an offence whether you're an applicant or an agent. The relevant person is the main duty holder within the Building Scotland Act, and it's a wee bit like the riddle of the Sphinx, trying to work out who the relevant person could be for a particular job. That is straight out of the legislation there. A, B, C, and A or B, depending. But basically, a simple interpretation of that, although it misses out some of the nuances, is a person that carries out the work for themselves, or a person who is having work carried out for them. And ultimately, it's the owner of a building. The guidance that the BSD have issued in the procedural handbook talks about the relevant person usually being the owner, tenant, or developer who's doing work on behalf of themselves or employing a contractor to do that work on their behalf. So in most cases, it's going to be the owner of a building, could be a tenant, could be a developer if developer owned the land that's being built upon. But that relevant person is really important because regardless of who signs the completion certificate, it's the relevant person that's always considered as having submitted the completion certificate. And that completion certificate certifies the work's been carried out in accordance with the approval, but also in accordance with the building regulations. Now, even if that declaration is signed by the agent, the offence is submitting a completion certificate that contains a statement that is false, whether recklessly or knowingly. Relevant people probably don't understand how exposed they are when their architect or otherwise agent submits a completion certificate on their behalf, but they are. Part of the work we're doing is hopefully going to surface that information through the compliance plan, through the local compliance plan manager, to make sure that the relevant person, when that completion certificate gets submitted, understands and is aware and has some knowledge that the building does comply before that completion certificate gets submitted, because they're the one that's left holding the duty at the end of the day. The other kind of main character within the system is the local authority verifier. Now, that's not local authorities aren't automatically considered to be the building standards verifier, but they're appointed by Scottish ministers. It just so happens that since the Act came into force 2005, every local authority has always been appointed as verifier for their geographical area, but they are audited. They are expected to follow a performance and operating framework. So it's not just you're doing this. It's yes, you can do this. We're allowing you to do this. But every application for building one is made to a verifier, and the verifier has a responsibility to only grant a building one if they're satisfied that the work will be carried out. And when that building is completed, that nothing in any of the plans or information that they've had submitted to them shows that it will fail to comply. So they have a responsibility, perhaps, for ensuring that the design of the building is compliant. And a verifier, as much as an applicant or a relevant person, can commit an offence under the Act and can be taken to task on that. The verifier also has a responsibility around the completion certificate, but the verifier has to carry out what's called reasonable inquiry. The certifying of compliance is done by the relevant person. The verifier does a check on that, doesn't inspect everything, isn't expected to be certifying compliance. They do reasonable inquiry, and that's a term that's within the legislation and hasn't yet been tested in the courts. But we do have guidance around what that should probably look like. The verifier has a number of kind of things that it can do. One of the things that's interesting that they can ask anybody who's made an application for a building warrant or submitted a completion certificate to carry out a materials test. Now, it's not a slump test or a cube test or anything like that. That can be a test of a combination of materials or the building as a whole, and that allows for things like airtightness testing and whatnot, but could allow for other various testing of various elements or combination of materials if the verifier felt that was necessary. And I suppose the last entity involved in terms of the Building Scotland Act is the local authority, who has separate roles, separate from their appointment as a building standards verifier. That's basically two things: to maintain a statutory building standards register, which is completely open to the public. It's not publishable online in terms of the drawings, but completely open to inspection in a reasonable time within the local authority estate. And they are the ones that carries out enforcement action, including referral to the court for those offences that I mentioned earlier. So how does this all kind of fit together? I suppose for compliance, we have a team on one side, and for regulating and enforcing, we've got a team on the other side. And when we start to think about, well, who is responsible for compliance, actually the relevant person is the one that's most responsible for compliance. The others, through contract, probably responsible for compliance or responsible for duties towards the relevant person for doing a good job and being reasonably assuring them that the building is going to comply. But contracts are out with the Building Scotland Act, so it's the relevant person. Along pops this concept of a compliance plan manager, and they're basically the intention is that there will be a requirement in legislation for a relevant person to appoint a compliance plan manager on their behalf for any relevant building warrant. At the moment we're talking about high risk buildings. That's the relevant application for building warrant. But for any relevant building will probably be what the legislation will say, and we build out secondary and guidance after that. The idea being that they're appointed at an early stage, certainly before a building warrant's made, and their main role is to work on behalf of that relevant person on their building standards compliance interests and duties, to help them, to support them in their role of certifying the build at the end of the day and being responsible for it. The intention is that they would work with the design team and contractor. They would identify the compliance risks, agree the compliance evidence, etc., so that relevant person can be convinced that the building does comply at the end. But they work with the design team and contractor to do that, and would be responsible for overseeing that compliance plan to make sure that it's fully developed, and it's subsequently discharged or completed, or whatever term we use for what state it's going to be in at the completion stage. There is an intention that they would be actually the point of contact for the local authority verifier. So the verifier would contact the compliance plan manager when they had any queries, particularly during the build stage, and to arrange any inspections, rather than contacting a contractor and a subcontractor and another subcontractor or whatever. They would confirm readiness and all these. I'm not going to go through them all because of time, but they basically act on behalf of the relevant person. So if we go back to this, actually, the responsibility for compliance and legislation is with the relevant person. Changes to legislation may put the compliance plan manager in there to help, but the responsibility for compliance would rest still with the relevant person. My experience working in building standards, this is normally how it works. And this, I'm the one with a cup of coffee and the high heels. I'm dealing with a large job as a building standards verifier. I might be speaking to the applicant. I'll be speaking to the agent. I might be speaking to an engineer. Might be speaking to 3 contractors and whatnot. And it gets quite confusing sometimes, where the actual link between for legislative purposes is direct to the relevant person. Both from the verifier and also from the local authority if it needs to take an enforcement action. So the relevant person needs a compliance plan manager to help them manage that compliance plan. That is that agreement in the middle of how we're going to monitor and what is going to be provided to the local authority and what is going to be provided to the relevant person in terms of compliance evidence. And that compliance plan manager is envisaged to be the person that fronts up for the relevant person, both with his design team and contractor and whatnot, and also with the local authority verifier. We do have a definition within that compliance plan handbook. The early adopter version will contain this. It is a work in progress. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but please go and read that document. I'll put a link at the end of the presentation on where to find it. There should be a building professional. That's something that John Cole's report into Edinburgh Schools suggested, that we're looking at someone who's a building professional providing that assistance. And they have a variety of things that I've already talked about. And importantly, one aspect that we're still looking at is what level of inspection that they would need to undertake. We're talking about it being based on a risk assessment. We are thinking now that it's not going to be an inspection to confirm something is or isn't compliant, because we have had a discussion with insurers around shifting around the liabilities and what's the best thing to do. So again, this is still a work in progress, but we do think that it shouldn't be forbidden for the compliance plan manager to be on site. But we're working with other colleagues and industry on that kind of part of it. So what we're kind of saying is the responsibility for compliance won't significantly change. We're still looking at minimum standards. We would hope that new buildings would exceed minimum standards for safety. The local authority will still carry out their inspections and checks, and so the local authority verifier and the local authority do their statutory enforcement, and the relevant person is still going to be responsible for compliance. So I'll move on to where we are with developing it and how we're moving towards implementing it. And this is, I suppose, our outline timeline. So going back to Building Standards Futures Board in 2019 and hoping to have a legislative slot for primary legislation at the beginning of the next Parliament. That's not confirmed. It might be further on than that, depending on who's in government and what their priorities are. But that's what we're going to try and push for as officials. We're kind of at this stage here where we've launched an early adopters phase 1. So where we've managed to wrangle 4 projects and try and get them to try the compliance plan processes, have a compliance plan manager, albeit not backed up by legislation, but we want to learn how our approach in theory might work in real life. We have done a pilot with in Dunfermline with partnership with Fife Council, and we get this wrong. I think it was BAM Construction. If it's not BAM, I apologise to BAM. Don't tell them if I got that wrong. But and that was helped us develop the framework for our compliance plan approach. But we've done quite a lot of research. We've had a public consultation around the compliance plan approach and the compliance plan manager role. All through that, the research, the public consultation, and any working groups and whatnot that we've had in the Future Board itself, we've had industry stakeholders involved all the way through that, and we want to continue to do that. Currently, we're looking at doing some workshops and case studies around the 4 early adopter projects, but we do need to do more in terms of having early adopter phases, seeing how things work, taking the feedback, and developing the proposals as we move forward. We also have to think about the Grenfell Phase 2 recommendations. So the UK government is planning on responding to those by the end of March, and the Scottish Government's committed to response at a similar timescale. So while we maybe understand some recommendations we're putting forward to ministers, ultimately whatever comes out of that will be an additional factor that we will have to incorporate into our plans, whether it's what we initially recommended or whether ministers decide to do something different. When we get to that legislative slot, 2026 plus, that's primary legislation. Building Scotland Act took 2 years from primary legislation passing to being implemented, because you have secondary legislation and then formal guidance to go after that. One of the ways that we are hoping to develop this and make sure people are ready for it is a phased introduction of different measures that build up to that full compliance plan approach for all building types. That phased introduction of measures is partly so we can make sure that local authorities are funded and prepared to do their role, and also the industry is understands what's going to be asked of them and can get up to speed on that. Building warrant fees were increased last year; they're going to be increased this year, and part of that is to fund the growth in building standards teams to cope with additional work that the compliance plan approach is expected to deliver. And that's not just necessarily about the compliance plan approach for high risk buildings, but that's thinking about, do we make the notifications that local authorities ask for in their compliance notification plans mandatory for response, and if it's a mandatory response by the relevant person or the contractor or whoever we consider is going to bring that back, is that a mandatory response to that response by the verifier? Do they have to come and inspect if they've asked to inspect something and actually get asked to do it? So these are all things that we're trying to scope out and see what capacity it is out there. And in terms of compliance plan managers, we need to make sure that by the time we bring them in, that they're actually something that exists. So we are working with industry on a industry-led competency scheme, and we're not, I suppose, relying on that, but we're hoping that will lead to a scheme that is across different professional disciplines in Scotland. We have a project at the moment it's looking to estimate the annual numbers of high-risk buildings that might need that full compliance plan approach and that compliance plan manager. And we are looking towards I think mentioned earlier, to the insurance industry to make sure that what we are bringing forward is something that actually can work. And we have heard that down in England, the proposal of principal designer, for example, that have strict liability might be an issue for the insurance industry. That said, is it appropriate for government to consider that the insurance industry is a measure by which they should implement something or not? It's an interesting question. The compliance plan component, sorry, the Passive House equivalent standard was something that I think was raised before we came to do this presentation, and it's really it's the compliance plan equivalent standard is going to be another element that needs to be provided with compliance evidence. We are, working closely with colleagues who are developing that approach to make sure there is a compliance plan component that fits quite well, as with any other part of compliance. So I'm gonna stop there because I've probably gone over my time, and just say thanks for listening. That's my contact details. I'm quite happy to speak to anybody about any element of what we've just made you listen to, and happy to come back. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Frank. Thank you. That was very, very informative, and yeah, diving deeply into the requirements and what's envisaged. We've got a few questions, so I'm going to try to read them out together. There's a few questions from Stuart Naismith, who's asking about the role of the CPM and whether is the agents who will be expected to become the compliance plan managers. He's also asking when is the next workshop in Aberdeenshire area and when the warrant fees will be increasing.
Okay, warrant fees is intent. Well, the ministers agreed that they'll be increasing again on 1st of April this year. A workshop in your area, I'm not sure. We can perhaps speak to building standards teams over in Aberdeenshire, see if they want to do something local. Whether that's something we would present at or something maybe they would want to do themselves, I'm not sure, but we can maybe take a note of that. And the other question, the first one, which I've forgotten, remind me.
That's okay. Whether the agent is expected to.
So not necessarily expected to. So the agent could be potentially the compliance plan manager. The idea is that they are perhaps independent from that design team, though, that it's someone that is advising that relevant person directly. Now, if you think about where there's a design and build, for example, that happens quite a lot within local authority work, the compliance plan manager would definitely not be employed by the design build contractor. They'd be expected to be on the client side because they're protecting their interests. Yes, so yeah, your answer, they could be, but they're not expected to be.
There was another question from Chris Andrews around whether, again, it is architect or agent, or if the role is envisaged to be transferred to the contractor. I see a little bit of an overlap with the approach or the questions around this and around, what was envisaged for the principal designer and principal contractor role. Is there any sort of, comparative thought process in there, or is it a completely separate role? This is something that I've kind of touched on when we discussed the session in the beginning. Also trying to understand, what qualification is required to become a compliance plan manager, and how is that knowledge and expertise going to be determined?
Yeah, I think the question about the roles of principal design and principal contractor down south, I think we need to say that we've got a different system. It's fundamentally different in a lot of ways, and we're proposing strengthening the system, not rebuilding it or redoing it. So we're not looking for radical changes here. We're not necessarily looking to introduce those two roles that you mentioned. That's not to say that politicians might want us to do that through the response to Grenfell Phase 2. So there aren't really any overlaps with it because we have a different system. And that new role is really the compliance plan manager is there to support that relevant person, whoever that is. Whether it's appropriate for the architect on a project design team to be the compliance plan manager or not, yeah, it's kind of as someone we'd say, is that marking their own homework kind of thing, and does that defeat the point of having that independent check on behalf of that relevant person that the people they've employed are doing what they've asked them to do, albeit that you'll be employing someone. Do you know what I mean? It's a difficult one. So we're not entirely, I suppose, completely there as to who that person needs to be. The skills, Gary may be able to talk a wee bit more about the accreditation scheme that's been worked on, but we've moved from talking of it being an accreditation scheme to be more of a competency scheme, partly because accreditation can mean different things to different people in the construction industry. So we're looking at a construction professional who's already at that level, but then maybe has those additional competencies around compliance and the role. Yeah, hope that answers it.
Perfect, thank you. There's a couple of more questions, so I'm going to go through them and then maybe we'll jump to Gary. Chris Andrews is asking, what are the examples of failure of the current system other than the two examples you provided at the start?
That's a good question. So we've got the high profile ones would be the DG4, the legislator in Dumfries and Galloway, which didn't open for a very long time after it had a completion certificate because it had lots of major faults. Although the Edinburgh schools was seen as being an isolated incident, actually there were lots of buildings all over the country which were built with the same fault in wall ties, where the gap was too big for the specified wall ties. There are lots. I mean, as I suppose as a building standards verifier, every major job that you go along to do, and DG1, I'm just reminded, not DG4, so thanks, Julian. Every kind of major project you go along to and do a completion inspection on, there are always things that are non-compliant. And there are always things that you pick up during the job that you think, well, if I hadn't picked that up, would that actually have been corrected? Whether that's inspecting cavity barriers or whatever above fire doors and finding they've got big holes in them. If I didn't pick that up, would they actually have been fixed? These kind of things. So I think there is plenty of evidence there without going into specific projects that needs strengthening. And the stuff that's coming out of Grenfell about the UK construction industry as a whole, if you read the Phase 2 report in detail about the lack of, and there were words used like ignorance, the architects were ignorant of their own roles and responsibilities, that subcontractors didn't really care whether they got things right because they felt that it was somebody else's responsibility to check it. All these things came through quite strongly in the Grenfell and also in the Edinburgh Schools report. But I suppose the Grenfell one is where those sweeping statements of failures of industry lead us to think that we have a good system, we have a preemptive system, we have a system where the verifier checks that design and is engaged and does independent inspections because they're not approved inspectors, they're not being purchased. I suppose that we have a strong model, but we need to strengthen it to make sure we don't encounter the same problems.
Thank you. There's a follow-up question from Chris as well, whether this new compliance plan approach is going to be more work for building surveyors.
For if you're talking about building standard surveyors and the local authority, yeah, absolutely, yeah, it will be. It will be. They'll be expected to be. Well, we're interested in a new phase, so we're introducing a pre-warrant application. We're introducing a lot of process around that, and in the construction process, you're expecting that the local authority verifiers will be on site more and will do more site inspections. That's why we've increased building warrant fees. Partly to do that is to allow them to increase their capacity.
Perfect. Gordon Suter is asking whether there will be a template, a compliance plan template that would provide guidance to both sides, I suppose, the verifier and the person who has to complete it.
Yeah, I mean, but we're working on guidance, and there is the kind of early adopters guidance that's available on the CQIC website. So if you go to CQIC, there's a tab at the top for building standards, and you'll find that early adopters handbook, which could be considered as an early draft of the compliance plan handbook, although it's just talking about new build, and the model forms that we've developed so far are there for anybody to have a look at, and I'm quite happy to get any comments on them.
Thank you. And we've got one more question from Stuart Davidson, which maybe you will try to tackle, and then we'll go on to Gary to talk about skills a little bit and the compliance or verification of skills and expertise. So Stuart Davidson's asking, if extended to all forms of projects, what control will there be on the quality of agent and drawing submission?
I think we have a different system in Scotland, and I was talking about this at a Grenfell meeting this morning, and that while in England they've introduced a principal designer as a duty holder, and they're expected to do X, Y, and Z, and the Grenfell Phase 2 recommendations are expecting that they'll have to sign a declaration, which will make them more liable. We have a reliance on the relevant person for the built product, and in terms of the design, we rely on the applicant and getting that right. But the gateway is there that you don't start work until the local authority have verified that plan, and they shouldn't be issuing the warrant unless they're really sure that'll be, if that's built as per plan, that it will comply. So we have a different system. We have a more major role for the local authority in terms of design compliance, but ultimate responsibility for the relevant person in taking that design. And regardless of what's on the plan, it has to comply with the regulations. So there's an overriding responsibility at completion stage on that relevant person.
Perfect. Thank you. Gary Mees, would you like to come in and comment on the skill element?
Thanks for that, Frank. I think that really kind of outlines what is, as you've said, very much a work in progress.
Yep.
Because the challenge we have is that this will require primary legislation and secondary legislation. And I seem to recall the last time we met, we were talking about 2026, 27. But given the other challenges that are coming along with Scottish Government, that may well drift. So we kind of don't know where we are with that. But just to talk about, we've been meeting as the sort of working group, but also along with that, we've been meeting with other professional bodies to look at a single scheme that oversees the professional bodies, CIAT, RIS, RICS. I've had meetings with ISTRUCD to try and get them to come along, whereby instead of what's happened down south and every professional, I think it's fair to say that the market isn't here for every professional body to kind of develop their own scheme. So it's very much in the early stages of, if you like, competencies as to who can go into this register. But that the way or the direction that we're looking at is that the register will be a single register, and all of that competencies, which have all been basically done before, because most of, well, CIAT has its own scheme for principal designers, i.e. building safety, not principal designers CDM, which they, unfortunately, I remember being at the very first MHCLG meeting about this following Grenfell, and they mentioned the principal designers, and I asked the question of why are you putting the same name, and it was supposed to be a holding name, but there you go. So yeah, I mean, there is work going. It kind of it's gone quiet a bit at the moment, but certainly I'll be chasing up Peter Drummond and the rest to see, right, we need to kind of get our heads together and develop this. Sam Allwinkle's involved in helping RIS look at this sort of stuff. So there's quite a good cohort of people looking at this as to how we move it forward. It hasn't moved much forward, but hopefully we get this kind of moving. One of the only things that we're talking about registers, and we already got register for RIS, already have certifiers and schemes, and none of this is compulsory, so you don't actually have to be in a register. It may, and that might be a challenge to some of the schemes, because, well, I always think we're a bit of an industry that wait till things happen before we have to do something, then you panic and you go, oh, maybe I should be part of this scheme, and you do it. But certainly, hopefully, at least having a docket, if you like, to say that I'm part of CIAT RIS bricks scheme, and I'm accredited. Well, sorry, I was about to use that accredited word, but it's not really accredited. But I have a certain standard of competencies that meets those schemes. Anything else, well, we don't know. I'm quickly looking over some of my notes from our last meeting in November. Positive, and I think the positive thing to come out is it's one scheme. Is that is for me much better. And as you've pointed out, I think down south they would love to have a preemptive scheme. Certainly at that meeting I just mentioned, that it was raised, why we're not looking at what's going on in Scotland, or what has been going on in Scotland for years. But I think it's too much of an exercise for them to dig themselves out of that hole. Anyway, that's about all I can say on that matter, unless anybody else has got questions.
I would just add that, you know, and you'll know this, Gary, but we are just about, or we have just commissioned or are commissioning research into that the relationship between what we see the compliance plan manager role and the client. So we are doing some more research on that will hopefully feed into you know, talks about what those competencies need to be, and what that relationship is, and that'll hopefully explore the different types of contracts, different types of makeup of design teams and stuff, and where that compliance plan manager should or shouldn't sit will maybe give us a bit more of a steer on that.
It's, I think you've heard my saying, because I've worked with HSE for the past 6 or 7 years. That in a statement I was kind of go back to is that legislation's compliant. Sorry, is contract neutral.
Yeah.
And if you get your head around that what that actually means is that you can have a contract, but in terms of CDM, I always kind of think, well, look at what it actually says in the regulations as to how you decide who should be who. In particular, CDM, if you're in charge of the design work, you're the CDMC, you're the principal designer. Sorry, where does that CDMC come from? You're the principal designer. Anyway.
Thank you. We don't have any more questions in the chat. If anybody wants to raise their hand, then you're welcome to. We've got 5 minutes. I wondered, Frank, if you could maybe tell us a little bit about the early adopter scheme and whether you're going to be asking certain people to join or take part, to have, you know, a breadth of experience and be able to then evaluate what's happening and pinpoint any gaps.
So our first phase was launched, and our idea was our first phase of early adopters would be for new build. So we were successful in getting 4 projects up and running with that. They are all local authority projects, and one of the reasons for that is there is a bit of nervousness about there in the private sector about taking on the role of compliance plan manager and what are the liabilities of that. What my response to that is been, well, there's nothing in legislation yet about compliance plan manager. There's nothing to hold your feet to the fire. This is about trying something and seeing how it works. But our next phase, we're still trying to decide what that's going to look like. Is that going to be in continuation? Are we going to start looking at alterations and extensions, substantial ones? Or are we going to take the opportunity that, say, something like Monklands Hospital gives us, of being a really big, interesting project that'll have a lot of different facets to it? Is that something to try the process against? What I would say is, if anybody's interested in participating in it, keep an eye on the CQIC website, because that's our channel, I suppose, for advertising where and when we're going with an early adopters scheme next. We have engaged Scottish Futures Trust to do some work over the next 3 months to the end of March on those existing early adopters projects that we have under the scheme, to do some group work with them, some workshops, and see what they can pull out. Not just in terms of feedback on the compliance plan role, but feedback on how we're approaching it as well, and how we get the best out of an early adopter scheme in terms of getting that feedback loop of, this is working, this doesn't work, this is stupid, this is a great idea, I think you should do this, whatever. Happy to listen to any and all feedback. So, and that's the same with anybody watching this now or in the YouTube future. That if they want to reach out, we're quite happy to talk.
And in terms of projects, is it at the moment predominantly new build, or are you looking at any retrofitting solutions as well?
It's new build at the moment, so we've got a high school, we've got a primary school, we've got a community centre, and we have crowbarred in some flats into that, which don't quite meet that 11 metre plus, but is a really engaged client in Edinburgh, and yeah, we thought that would be good even to think about flats and how they would fit into it. They're not, it's not quite the high rise, but just shy of it. We will probably come to a point where we're looking at things other than new build, whether that's alteration, extension, conversions. Retrofit might come into that if it needs a building warrant. If it's retrofit that doesn't need a building warrant, not saying we don't care, but it's not really within the basket for us.